Hello, my name is Kathy Krejci, and I am Director of Technical Services at Terminix. I am honored to be with all of you today, giving this virtual presentation. I also get to give it in person at the in-person sessions, but I'll join you all in the live Q&A in a little bit. Today I'm talking about demystifying insecticide formulations. And from my background, I've spent quite a bit of my career in manufacturing before I came to service. And I think it has lended me to be an advocate for knowing our tools. And that's where I gathered all the information for this presentation. I gathered it from listening to scientists in the field, but also learning from technicians in the field and saying this is what works the best. So everything you're going to see today is applied information. So the demystifying part of insect formulations, I hope we don't get too far into the weeds of the difference between an adjuvant and a surfactant, but knowing what is important to look at for formulations that can make your service that much better. So let me go ahead and share my screen. There we go. So if you've ever heard me speak before, you know that one of the platforms I stand on is that I love sharing information, whether it's on social media, live in one of these conferences, or on a webinar. And I share that information because I truly believe that we all need to be be good at pest control. Whether you work for Terminix, whether you work for a local pest control company or any company in between, we all need to be good at pest control to be advocates for this industry. So anything that you hear today as far as products goes, those are not endorsements or products. They're just materials that I've worked with in the past. And please understand that regardless of what we talked about today, it's always important to consult a product label before you set off on utilizing these tools. But overall, I hope the goal that we accomplish today is that you understand the different types of insecticide formulations a little bit better, and that we can all be a little bit better at pest control. So often I hear people compare insecticides as if they're apples to apples because they have the same active ingredient. So just because one product contains clothianidin and another contains clothianidin doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to kill an insect the same way. So the point of this conversation is, why do formulations and active ingredients and labels all matter? We look at all of those things independently and together to evaluate a material's efficacy. We'll cover buzzwords a little bit later, but overall, label language means something, and it has to be proven. So just because something says, oh, knockdown means a thing. And kill means something completely different than control. So the efficacy of that formula can make a big difference in the way you see it perform in the field. Safety is a huge part of looking at formulations. So safety for the environment, meaning are we able to keep active ingredients from running off or drifting based on the formulas that we're using? Or can we protect an applicator by using a formulation that is a little less toxic to the applicator? But also resistance management. Resistance management is a large driver for understanding your tools, not just in the active ingredient perspective, but how can we use formulations to combat resistance in the field? So on that resistance note, I wanted to do a quick touch base on what is resistance. Resistance is the genetic ability of an organism, of an insect, to tolerate the poisonous effects of a toxicant like an insecticide. And because insects are our strategists, meaning they breed and have numerous populations in a very short amount of time with a lot of individuals, they're able to pass that information along from generation to generation very quickly. Information on how to resist the toxic effects of these insecticides is inheritable. So there's 4 types of resistance that we think about whenever we're battling insecticide resistance, or when we're talking about insecticide resistance. One of those is cuticular resistance. So insects have that hard exoskeleton on the outside that's supposed to protect them from the environment. Cuticular resistance means that they have developed a cuticle that is a little bit thicker. And so whenever we're trying to use insecticides to penetrate the cuticle and be absorbed by the insect, it's a little bit harder whenever the cuticle is thicker. You also have target site resistance. And so target sites are basically the goalposts we're looking for whenever we're using insecticides to kill insects. And the insecticide has been developed to fit right into that target site. But because of overexposure to an active ingredient or sublethal doses, an insect is able to modify the target site within their nervous system and resist the toxic effects of that insecticide. So that's just another form of resistance. Another one would be metabolic resistance. And it's kind of the other side of that, in that the insect's metabolic system recognizes insecticide as an intruder, and it takes it out before it ever reaches the target site. So I compare those two a lot like a lock and key mechanism. So for target site resistance, you have a lock in which the insecticide is the key, and we're trying to get the key into the lock and open the door. But with target site resistance, your lock is full of gum and your key does not fit. And so therefore the insecticide doesn't work. Alternatively, metabolic resistance is a lot like having gum on that key. It's just not going to fit into the lock. It's never going to make it to the target site, and therefore the insect survives your insecticide application. And finally, the last one, which is probably the most poorly understood, but the easiest to explain, is behavioral resistance, in which the insect just figures out what you're doing. They're animals just like us. They have behavioral characteristics that have allowed them to survive for very, very long. And they're able to pass that genetic information for how to survive humans from one generation to the other. And so all these things come into play whenever we're choosing materials to kill insects. And it's a driving force behind understanding your tools. So what are we doing today? I kind of want to break this conversation into a couple different parts. First, I think while this isn't a discussion about active ingredients, I think it's great to have a touch base on active ingredients as part of these larger formulation discussions. And so then we'll jump into the different types of formulations. And I want to wrap up with a few buzzwords. Most of those buzzwords will come from just conversations I've had in passing. A lot of times when I post little like TikToks or LinkedIn posts related to the science behind pest control, people say, well, what about this? And so I took some of those questions and put them into the buzzwords section of this presentation. So let's start out with active ingredients. Understanding your active ingredients are really important for setting customer expectations. Not only do we want to understand resistance management and use our tool properly, but we want to tell the homeowner or the business owner exactly what to expect out of the services that we are providing. So there's two principal means of classification for insecticides. We look at how do they get to the insect, and then their mode of action, meaning how does the active ingredient actually kill the insect. So this is an old graphic from my friend Tommy Powell at MGK, and I like to use it because it just lays out the map of modes of action very simply. There's more than one way to cook a duck. There's more than one way to kill an insect, and modes of action are how we kill that insect. So similar to how we group insects into groups because of their characteristics, we group insecticides into groups based on how they kill an insect. So you have your nervous system, which using insecticides that affect the nervous system result in overstimulation of nerves. We can affect energy production, we can affect water balance, along with cuticle production and endocrine system. So let's take a little closer look at that. So I'm popping this up because it is a document that I use all the time to have these types of conversations. The Insecticide Resistance Action Committee, or IRAC, has this chart that I have laminated. I put it on my desk. I show it all the time. If you scan that QR code, it'll take you straight to the website where you can find that information, not just this PDF, but a lot of information around it. But they've taken all the insecticides that we use across the world, all the active ingredients that we use across the world, and grouped them into modes of action, meaning how the different active ingredients compare and contrast in the way in which they kill an insect. And a lot of people ask, well, how do I know? Do I have to search this document over and over? And you can do that. But I will say there are a lot of manufacturers that are getting onto the resistance management bandwagon by just making it a little bit more easy and putting that IRAC number at the top of a label. Now, this isn't a required part of an insecticide label, but it definitely is a helpful way to have a conversation about rotating active ingredients. So you can see this right here, Veneta Plus has 2 active ingredients, abamectin, which is in group 6, and pyriproxyfen, which is group 7C. And we'll talk a little bit about both of those groups now. So let's talk about the nervous system. So the nervous system for an insect is that central nervous system consisting of a brain and then, located dorsally in the body with a ventral train of ganglia. And these ganglia have bundles of neurons in which the peripheral nerves run along. They sense organs, muscle systems. The insect's nervous system is a network of specialized cells called neurons. And that is the information highway of the insect's body, but it's also the target for a lot of insecticides that fall into this nervous system group. So most of the insecticides that you will use fall into one of the groups that are classified as nervous system insecticides. So group 2 are the phenylpyrazoles, meaning fipronil. And I'm going to take a really quick moment to say, whenever we talk about active ingredients, there are all kinds of active ingredients that fall into the same group, and that's why this conversation is really important. So I can say words like bifenthrin and deltamethrin, and using those 2 active ingredients is not a rotation of class because they both fall within group 3 of the pyrethroids. What we mean when we're talking about rotation is to truly rotate these classes. So we have a group 2 that we just discussed, the fipronil, group 2B, but rotation would look like next using group 3 within the pyrethroids and the pyrethrins. Again, pyrethroids and pyrethrins include things like bifenthrin, cyphenethrin, deltamethrin, S-phenvalerate, those kinds of things. And all of these are sodium channel modulators, which is just a fancy way of saying they affect another part of the insect's nervous system. Moving on, group 4 has your neonicotinoids, including active ingredients like dinotefuran, imidacloprid, clothianidin, and again, another part of the nervous system. Group 5 would be your spinosins with the active ingredient spinoside, affecting site 1 of the allosteric modulator within the nervous system. And then finally, group 6, ivermectins with the active ingredient abamectin. So those are the 5 primary groups you're going to deal with whenever we're like, all right, how do we target an insect's nervous system? We can move on, though, to energy production. Why do we look at energy production? Does anybody remember basic biology from even high school? Mitochondria are the powerhouse of the cell. And because insects are animals, that is very true for them too. Mitochondria are the tiny organelles inside the cells that are involved in releasing energy from food. So this process is known as cellular respiration. And so it's for this reason that mitochondria are often referred to as the powerhouses of the cell. And so there's a couple different groups within the IRAC chart that we look at to basically halt insects in their track. So within the nervous system, we were overexciting the nervous system and it would result in paralysis. But for energy production, if we're targeting that mode of action, your insect's basically going to be the Energizer bunny that ran out of battery because they're no longer able to generate energy from that powerhouse. So group 13 would be your active ingredients like chlorphenapyr, and then group 21 would be like tolfenpyride as your active ingredient, and then group 8 would be your fumigate gases like sulfurofluoride. And all of those, again, affect the energy production. So one thing you also see is that a lot of times when we're talking active ingredients, they will fall into more than one of these 5 groups. So they may groups of that I have on the screen. So group 8 falls into both energy production and water balance, because along with stopping an insect in their track, they're also able to inhibit water balance as well. So water balance is really important for insects. It's a very scary thing for insects. Exoskeletons are not great at holding in water. If you remember, another thing from high school biology is osmosis. So osmosis is the movement of a solvent like water through a semi-permeable membrane, like a living cell or even an insect exocuticle, into a solution of higher concentrate. So if you're using an active ingredient that is a higher solute concentrate than the insect, you can desiccate or dry out that insect. So group 8 would be things like borates, boric acid, and again, those do things like halt an insect in its tracks and affect the water balance and dry out the insect. Another thing here, you'll see when you pull up the IRAC chart, you'll see a bunch of gray boxes. Those gray boxes include active ingredients that just don't really fit elsewhere because they really have unknown modes of action. So that UNM means unknown modes of action. And specifically when we're talking about water balance, we're looking at things like diatomaceous earth and silica that are just non-specific mechanical and physical disruptors for water balance within insects. Finally, what are the 2 blue boxes? They're different color. What does that mean? So insect growth regulators are specific active ingredients that don't necessarily target adult insects, but target the immature version of all of the insects that we're talking about. And I could talk all day about IGRs, but that's not the point of today's talk. Insect growth regulators can be put into 2 groups. And similar to talking about the difference between a group 13 that affects energy production or a group 2 that affects the nervous system, not all IGRs are created equal. So you see over there with the endocrine system, group 7 would be your juvenile hormone mimics. And these have caused things like Janice Reed taught me, she calls it the Peter Pan syndrome, meaning that they never grow up. By imitating the juvenile hormone within an insect's metabolics or within their endocrine system, you're able to keep insects from reaching adulthood. You keep them immature forever. Another way to do that is through cuticle production, basically interrupting metamorphosis and inhibiting chitin formation. You do this with active ingredients like novaluron and novafluveron in group 15, but essentially that hard exoskeleton never comes to fruition and the insect dies because they're malformed before they reach adulthood. So that's a quick look at active ingredients. Everything we just talked about is kind of similar if you take a look at that IRAC chart. So basically we talked about the nervous system. All of those are going to fall within the blue boxes on your IRAC chart. Water balance will be pretty much segregated to the gray boxes. Energy production will be affected by those in the red and gray boxes. And then IGRs will fall in those green boxes. And again, you're looking at more than just professional pest control here. You're looking at agriculture pest control as well across the world. So I hope that tool helps you. And now we get to move on to the meat of today's talk, which is formulations. Formulations is really important, because while we spend a lot of time talking about active ingredients, there's the other 99% of what is in a bottle is the formulation. So just because, again, the active ingredient is different doesn't mean that the formulation doesn't have a ton to do with its success, however you're using it. So what is a formulation? Most insecticides do not come ready to use. So there are several insecticides that can be sold in a lot of different formulations. So we'll use the Alpine brand, for example. You have Alpine WSG, you have Alpine PT, Alpine Dust, Alpine Foam, Alpine Bait. There's probably a few more I'm missing in there, but active ingredients and novel formulations generally must be mixed with water, oil, and other inert ingredients so that they can be spread evenly by application equipment, regardless of what form they are in. Carriers like water and oil are expensive to ship, so most of what you purchase is in concentrate. You add the water, you add the heavy stuff to keep your costs down. It's up to you to read the label, it's up to you to mix it correctly. It's up to you to care for it properly until it's applied. And to the best of your ability, you want to understand these formulations so that you don't lose money, so that you're not tank mixing things that aren't compatible or applying it in a way that's not going to be effective just based on the solution that it is. And so in this decision, you have several factors to consider. We talked about the effectiveness against a pest. You're not going to use a cockroach bait against a mosquito because that doesn't make any sense, but that is a formulation difference that just isn't compatible with the pest you're going after. Habits of the pest are something to consider when you're looking at formulation. The surface to be protected, meaning is it porous or non-porous? Are you applying it indoors or outdoors? What equipment do you have available? A lot of times when people ask me, what can I do about XYZ? My first question is, what do you want to use? What's on your truck right now that you have available? And that is a lot of the driving force behind what we're able to use from a formulation perspective. Importantly, what is the drift and runoff danger? What are we looking at as far as wind speed? Do we need to be considerate of the fact that, again, it's the last week of November right now, and Buffalo, New York just got 77 inches of snow. And so do we be cognizant of snow on the ground to take care of a specific pest, or what does the environment look like? And all of that plays a role in how we make these formulation decisions. And it's why I believe we can't do the same thing all year, every year. Pest control changes for a lot of different reasons. So we talked about active ingredient bit, but let's talk about the other parts, the other 99%. Just like I said, the water, the emulsifiers, the solvents, the surfactants, all the other parts that make these active ingredients perform like they're supposed to. So there are lots of different components. A lot of times what you'll use are formulations with a single active ingredient, but there are options to have dual active ingredients, sometimes as many as 4 or 5 active ingredients. And this can include things like a nerve toxicant like a pyrethroid plus a desiccant, if you will, and then an IGR, and then you can have a synergist in there as well, and you get up to 3, 4, 5 active ingredients as the 1%, the 5% of your formulation. From there, you also have to have a carrier. Most often what you're going to use in formulations are water or oil, water being the primary there, but you also have the ability to use air. Foam uses air as a carrier whenever you foam out of a can, or use a foamer to create a foam solution. You also have dry carriers in the form of corncob baits for ant baits, for example. You have clay, talc, sand. All of those are dry carriers for active ingredients. And then the bulk of what makes it up is the others, the things that change ever so slightly with different formulations. Additives like adjuvants that enhance product performance. Adjuvants specifically provide efficient delivery of active ingredients. They reduce the amount of active ingredient delivered. You also have emulsifiers in there, stabilizers. You have synergists. I mentioned the two most popular in professional pest control are piperonil butoxide and MGK264. Both of those take care of the P450 enzymes that affect metabolic resistance that we talked about a little bit earlier. You have surfactants. Surfactants are a substance which tends to reduce the surface tension of a liquid and makes it a little bit stickier. So sometimes people call surfactant stickers because it allows a highly viscous liquid to stick to where you're putting it, like the underside of a leaf, if you will. So what makes this conversation a little bit more confusing is all the abbreviations that people use to describe different formulations. I'll pause here for a second to just let you, absorb this a little bit. But I think one important part of this conversation is that the abbreviations behind formulations is not standardized. A lot of times, whenever you name an insecticide, there's a few rules, but using EC on an emulsifiable concentrate is not a requirement. In fact, you can call a solution whatever you want it to be from a marketing perspective. So I appreciate a lot of times when products like these include, that little notifier that says, hey, I'm working with an SC. I don't have to ask what's in this bottle. It is a water soluble granule, in that Alpine bottle. But it's important to, feel comfortable asking the formula. Now that we're going to go through this conversation, you're going to understand a little bit more about formulations, and you're like, that's what I need. Besides active ingredient and understanding active ingredients, I hope you say that's the formula that's going to work best for this situation, and I know I need this formula. And so I want you to feel comfortable asking your manufacturing partners, hey, tell me about what type of formula that is. And I had it in here because I do truly feel like, while we can put WP on there, we can put EC, we can pretty much put whatever we want on a bag of insecticide. And so this is my insecticide, Tinker Fairy Dust, FD, it's a new formula, 99% fairy dust. But it just goes to show that when it comes to those formulations, you can't necessarily rely on what is on the surface level of a bag or a bottle to tell you exactly how it's going to work. So it's important to read the label and ask questions before you just dive in. So I developed a decision tree to help with this conversation. So I get a thrill out of explaining really difficult pest control topics in ways that I hope everybody can understand. It's the reason I do this job. And so generally when I've seen people teach formulations, it's like, all right, here's what it is. Here's the advantages to this formulation. Here's the disadvantages. And I wanted to include that. And they also talk about abbreviations. So I wanted to include that. But what does it all mean? I think it's important to walk away and know exactly what it means to you after this presentation. So we're going to work our way through this decision tree. I want you to know that this is mine, and I want you to use it, but it can be adapted for what is important to you. So if you only utilize a subset of these formulas, if you only utilize a handful of equipment, say you don't use dusters, or maybe you don't use backpack mist blowers, maybe it's even application areas or even target insects. Say you only do mosquito works, baits won't be important. We can take that part out of here. I want you to manipulate this decision tree into a way that is useful for your organization. And so let's dive into it. So starting with, do you need a small amount, or do you need small area applications with small amounts of AI? If your answer is yes there, you're going to dive right into your ready to use products. So ready to use products, there's a lot of different formulas that would fall into the RTU category: dust, granules, baits, aerosols. The great thing about these is that there is no mixing. They're ready to use, and that's what makes a lot of the consumer market or the shelf market so successful, is because they are so easy to use, right? They're great for small areas. They are in low concentration, so there's rarely any major safety hazards associated with ready-to-use products. The issue is that there's no way to adjust the application rate of the active ingredient. You're a professional, you know exactly what levels of AI you need for different situations, but with ready-to-use products, there's not a lot of adjusting that can happen there. You also end up carrying a lot of water or carrying a lot of weight in the form of granules by using ready-to-use products, because again, they're ready to use. There is no mixing, and sometimes that shipping or that carrying can be expensive for your bottom line. So within that RTU category, we ask ourselves things like, are social insects the target? If social insects are the target and you still need a ready-to-use product, let's look at granules and baits. So for passive pest control, meaning I'm going to apply something, I want it to be systemic, we look at granules. And if we want active pest control, let's look to baits, something where we can really target exactly what we're looking for, maybe ants. So baits are, again, ready to use, but they're active ingredients that are adhered to a food or an attractant. A lot of times this can be a cockroach bait in the form of a paste or a gel, but there's always a food attractant associated with that bait. It is another route of pest control through ingestion, not just the absorption of active ingredient. But one of the disadvantages about baits is that they can stain. Alternatively, granules are active ingredients that are coated on the outside of a clay or a talc heavy carrier. And this will carry the active ingredient to the target pest. It can protect the degradation of an active ingredient because it'll degrade slower. And you can really target applications in small areas with granules if needed. The one issue about granules is that they do need moisture for activation, and they can be a little bit risky around birds and other wildlife. And so a lot of times too, these two categories will interact, right? Sometimes you have granular baits in the form of fly baits. You have things like Delta Guard G, which is an insecticide granule. You also have Extinguish Plus, that is a corn cob carrier. One of those is the Delta Guard G is a true granule in which we're looking for, systemic pest control, but Extinguish Plus is a bait in the form of a granule where we're waiting on an ant to take the bait in a granule form back to the colony. And so a lot of times, again, these two categories collide, but it's just important to recognize what your goal is and what the product is and make sure it meets that. From there, we also ask, are we treating voids? If we aren't treating social insects, let's move to the next question and say, are we treating voids? And we can look at things like dust and foams here. Of those voids, are we treating just general voids like a weep hole, or are we treating specific voids like a drain? So dusts are not great for large area applications just due to drift. They outside, you got to stick to spot treatments like cracks and crevices and weep holes, but they do have long residuals. They're easily picked up by your target pests, and they do benefit pest control because there's multiple routes of entry there. Not only are they absorbing active ingredient, but they're often grooming. The insects are grooming themselves and taking in the dust through the grooming process. Because again, they're not great because they're dusty. That means increased toxicity, and they are inhalation risks as a disadvantage to a dust application. Examples of dust include things like Tempo, 1% dust, Delta dust, and Maxa dust. Now foams, again, if you're looking for that household drain protection, you're looking for wood production. So foam is created by adding a foaming agent to a finished dilution of an insecticide, and then mixing air with the liquid right before it's sprayed. So combining air and liquid produces the foam. These are usually water-based formulas. And they're great because they spread around objects. When you inject a small space, like we were talking about, how do we get here? We got here because we needed to treat a void. Traditional liquids are going to be sprayed into a space, and they're going to hit it 2D. You're not going to be able to curve around a stud if you're doing a wall void. But with foams, the foam will fill that space, and that's where it's really advantageous to use a foam. Disadvantages, they're niche. There's not a ton of places. You're not going to only use the foam in a structure. You're going to use foam plus something else. And if needed, they can be difficult to clean up if that situation occurs. Examples of foam include things like Termidor foam, Nyward D plus IGR foam is a brand new one, and then Pro Foam is actually a foaming agent that can mix with different insecticides to turn them into foam applications. From there, if we don't have social insects as our target, if we're not treating voids, maybe we're looking for interior knockdown, and that's where we get to aerosols. Aerosols are active ingredients plus solvents in a small self-contained unit, aka the aerosol can. One of the inert ingredients within an aerosol is a pressurized gas that pushes the insecticide through a very fine opening. When the gas is released, it creates really fine particles. Aerosols do a really good job of filling a space, but sometimes they struggle to stick to a surface. So you can struggle with residual control related to aerosol use. They penetrate cracks and crevices, but again, sometimes they're not the best for residual control. They're more fit for that knockdown and ready to use part of it. So those are all the RTUs. If we didn't need a small area application, we ask our next question. Our next question is, do we have a water source and equipment appropriate for water applications? Most of the time you're going to say, yeah, I have a whole truck full of water. But if not, ULV might be the right choice. If ULV is not the fit, we got to go back to a RTU group, and we would readdress there. But let's talk about ULV for a second. ULV stands for ultra low volume. These are liquids applied in very small droplets, less than 30 microns. We're not talking fumigant size droplets here, but definitely less than 30 microns to get a true ultra low volume application. Generally, these are applied neat, as I say, with little to no dilution with water or oil. There's no need to mix them. Because of that small droplet size, they do penetrate and fill space really well, even better than aerosols, more economically than aerosols. But they do require special equipment. Most of the time you will need a fogger of some sort, whether it's cold fogger or a thermal fogger, to apply this product, and that creates a inhalation risk. And again, low residual because of the droplet size. Great for knockdown, not great for residual control. Examples of ULVs include Riptide, Shockwave Fogging Concentrate, ULD BP 100, ULD BP 300 are all examples of that. So again, if ULV is not the answer, go back up and look at those RTU products. However, if you do have water, let's go to the next question. Do you want to use a finished solution in the tank for an extended time? Meaning, are you going to use it all right now? Or would you like to be able to tank mix and let it stay stable in the tank for longer than the next 5 hours? If the answer is yes, let's make a decision on single active ingredient versus multiple active ingredients. And the reason we look at that is because we're looking at solutions and soluble emulsions. So in essence, solutions are few and far between. There is limited availability, but a solution is, a a very basic form of a true insecticide solution. The active ingredient dissolves readily in a liquid solvent. It doesn't settle out because the active ingredient is liquid. It's very fine. There's no issue. There's no emulsifier required. They are economic. And while that all sounds really wonderful, there's just not a ton on the market. And so, but again, they do a really good job of not falling out. The other side of that is cesspool emulsions. Cesspool emulsions are formulations that are used to combine two active ingredients with like polar opposite physical properties in one formulation. So they're basically a combination of suspension concentrates, which we'll talk about here in a minute, and concentrated aqueous emulsions, or EWs. The benefits of these is that, again, you're combining multiple active ingredients for a broader spectrum of pest control. It essentially becomes this ready-to-use mix that doesn't ever fall out, but it is a more expensive manufacturing process, as you can imagine. Examples of this include Crossfire and Sabari. And you can see over there this picture of a cesspool emulsion. It looks like a true true thick formula, but it is not quite as thick as some we will talk about soon. All right. If you don't have concerns with the finished solution being available for an extended time, say you're planned your day, you know exactly where you're going to use everything, it's not really a big concern. Let's move on. And as we move down this chart, recognize that we're getting more and more options in our portfolio. So it's okay to say, I don't really need that available for 6 hours. Let me see what else is available. So if that's not a concern, we ask ourselves a fourth question. Do you want to start the day with a dry concentrate for a higher load of active ingredient? Meaning, I might do a dry active ingredient. If the answer is yes, are there any inhalation concerns should be your next question. And that kind of drives where you look at for your next formulation. Inhalation concerns, we would stick to a WDG, and if not, a WP and a soluble powder. So how do those compare? Water dispersible granules are, they're solid, non-dusty granular formulas, which disperse and dissolve quickly when added to water. This is basically like a wettable powder, but larger granules. They're easy to measure, they're easy to mix. They have, again, less inhalation risks, but because that particle is larger, they require constant agitation. The wettable powder are powder formulations that form a suspension when mixed with water prior to spraying. And so this is essentially, instead of being the active ingredient being attached to this granule, it's just a finer particle of talc or clay that you mix with water. These turn out to be good general formulations. Again, wettable powder and soluble powders are really similar, so we're going to talk about them together. You'll notice on the chart, in fact, a lot of people use those terms interchangeably. The active ingredient remains on the surface because, again, it's adhered to this very fine particle. So even if you're treating a porous surface like someone's yard, the active ingredient is staying on top even when your water carrier falls through. And back to our chart, inhalation risks are a problem or are something to be concerned about when you're considering using wettable powders or soluble powders. So if you don't need a drier concentrate, if your next question to ask is, do you have fine mist equipment available? If the answer is no, that leads us to another question of, do you need it to go to work immediately? If the answer is yes, you would look at suspension concentrates. No, and something with a residual extended release period is actually preferred. You would look at a microcap. So suspension concentrates are formulas that consist of a solid active ingredient dispersed in water. And you can see it in that picture on the left. This is an active ingredient adhered to clay, but also suspended in a liquid to make it into this really thick formulation. That tube I actually took a picture of. It was like I'm going to shake this. And I'm like, no, I'm not, because I want to show you exactly what I'm talking about. So basically, suspension concentrates have really grown in popularity. You would use these in products like Termidor, but they've grown in popularity because they're an absence of dust if they're already mixed into this thick liquid formulation that you then also mix into water. They're easy to use, they're highly effective, and they're highly effective when compared to other formulations like ECs and wettable powders. The one issue which you can see in that picture is that they will settle. They may leave a residue because of that clay suspension, and they can be hard on equipment because you can see the difference between the carrier and the clay that helps carry that active ingredient. So we talked about also, if you need it to work immediately, SC would be the way to go. But if you have time, you're looking for a residual extended release, go over to the microcaps from here. So microencapsulated solutions are just active ingredients that are coated in either starch or polymeric material. One note here, not all microcaps are created equal. So every manufacturer has a slightly different microcapping procedure. So while a lot of different formulas are labeled as micro encapsulated, that cap can look a lot different. From here, you're going to have less knockdown with a micro encapsulated solution, but you do have more residual activity just because the active ingredient is protected post application. You have reduced photodegradation. If you're somewhere, I'm in Texas, and so sometimes whenever it's really hot, microcaps can help us protect the active ingredient, and it also adds to applicator safety by reducing toxicity of active ingredients whenever they are microcapped. The issue is that sometimes they can last a little bit long. that would be in the disadvantages, is sometimes they're not immediately available to control a persistent population in the beginning, and they do require constant tank agitation because much like an SC, they want to settle. They want to settle the bottom of that jar, the bottom of your tank. Finally, we'll ask our last question. If you have fine mist equipment available, that gives us a couple more options. But we need to ask one more question: is phytotoxicity a concern? If the answer is no, we go to ECs. The answer is yes, we can go to EWs. So ECs, let's start. There's two times. ECs are emulsifiable concentrate. EWs are emulsions in water. But what is an emulsifier? Emulsifiers are chemical additives that just basically encourage the suspension of one liquid into another. So in both of these, you're going to see liquid active ingredients. For ECs, the AI is dissolved in a solvent and emulsifiers, and it's designed to form an oil in water. However, almost a mirror side of that is an emulsion in water is the liquid AI are dissolved in solvent plus water, so oil in, water in. Advantages: ECs are highly economic for the price that you're going to pay for them. The issue is, though, that they will try to oil up, meaning you want to be really careful about adding them to tanks. They need to be last that go in, otherwise they might gum up a solution pretty quickly, and they can be phytotoxic because of that high oil content. EWs, benefits include that they do have reduced dermal toxicity and reduced phytotoxicity. They have smaller particle sizes than EC, which is advantageous whenever you're talking about fine mist applications and trying to get a bunch of particles into the environment. I would call this a disadvantage, but they are specific for low volume and mist blowers. You don't want to coarse spray an EW. You want to have the right equipment whenever you're trying to use this type of formula. So I'm going to pause here, let you take a picture. This is, again, the decision tree I created for this conversation, meaning we had a whole host of different types of formulas that we needed to cover just for this conversation. But this decision tree can be adapted based on your business. And if you need help with that, I'm happy to. So let's take a minute to talk about buzzwords. So I recently made a TikTok and it made this a really cool conversations, but pyrethrins and pyrethroids are not created equal. I hear of this pyrethrins, pyrethrum, natural pie, they're all used interchangeably sometime, but I wanted to clear the air on these active ingredients. So pyrethrum and pyrethrins are insecticides extracted from certain species of flowers within the chrysanthemum family. In fact, you can see one on my wall right there. That's a chrysanthemum plant. Pyrethrins are the 6 active molecules or esters that act as the killing agents within that extract that was pulled from the pyrethrum flower. So pyrethrum is the total extract from the flower, while pyrethrins are the refined 6 esters. So alternatively, pyrethroids, these are the synthetic compounds that are produced in a lab to mimic the effects of the pyrethrin esters. So pyrethroids contain fewer chemical variants, usually 1, as opposed to the 6 esters in pyrethrum. So they're slightly less variable. They're just mimicking 1 part or 1 ester within the pyrethrin. Pyrethrins are pretty broad spectrum. They kill a wide variety of insects. Pyrethroids do too, but pyrethroids are going to have a little longer residual. They're going to resist breaking down in the environment, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's again more about knowing your tools and choosing the right one for the job. So I like using this analogy whenever we talk about pyrethrum and pyrethroids. So every time pyrethrum is harvested from the flower, a different concentration of those esters is included in the extract. So that's a lot like this gumball machine containing a random number of different colors. Pyrethroids, however, contain the same compounds each time it's produced, like a gumball machine with only yellow gumballs. So as a result, insects can develop resistance to pyrethroids a little more quickly than pyrethrins, but again, things like the growing season or how much water a chrysanthemum crop received will affect what color gumballs we're getting out of that plant that year. Another analogy is comparing it to like having a cup of coffee or a Coke anywhere in the world. Coffee is going to taste a little bit different based on where the coffee bean was grown. However, Coke is generally going to taste the same regardless of where you have it. So that's my pyrethrin and pyrethroid story, and I enjoy telling it because, again, knowing your tools is really important. Another thing I wanted to hit on was a little bit about marketing and label language. And a few of these ideas were thrown to me through social media where people were like, hey, can you explain this? So I popped them up here as just a way to wrap up our conversation. So flushing and flushers are a huge topic because I don't know that people understand what the intent behind the word is. So flushers are formulations that force cryptobiotic insects from their hiding spots. So cryptobiosis is a metabolic state of life entered by an organism in response to the adverse environmental condition. Based on what we talked about earlier, tell me what an adverse environmental condition is. It's not just being cold, it's not just being like too light, but application of insecticides can create adverse environmental conditions. So we use flushers to knock them out of that state of resistance to what we are applying, to flush them, literally and figuratively, out of their hiding spot and out of this cryptobiotic state of being, and get them out of their harborage. And a lot of times that is to run them across our chemical barriers that we've put down. So that is what a flusher does, and that is the act of flushing insects out of not just the cryptobiotic state of being, but their hiding spots as well. Repellents versus non-repellents. I think that we could have a whole class on this. Formulations can limit repellency. So repellents act in general as a chemical barrier or a knockdown agent. There's something, again, in that nerve toxin group that stimulate nerve responses from insects. The speed of the active ingredient that we're talking about determines the level of repellency that we should be talking about. So not everything is just, repellent or non-repellent. There is that side of it, but degree of repellency is also a part of the conversation. And so based on whether it's a type 1 pyrethroid or type 2 pyrethroid, changes the level of repellency. Knockdown is a word that is used a lot. I don't think a lot of people understand that it is a regulated term. Knockdown is time-based, meaning speed of which an insect is knocked down, but it does not include mortality. When people talk about knocking down insects, it doesn't mean that the insect did not get back up. Knockdown just means that basically they were slowed to move. There is words like quick kill and kill on contact that are regulated. So is knockdown. But I think it was important to point out for this conversation that knockdown is not dead in terms of label language. Residual, having a continued lethal effect over a period of time. Lethal is really important there. You'll notice that I pointed out the word time on both knockdown and residual, whether we're talking about time to death, knockdown, residual. Again, all of these had to do with certain time restrictions that the EPA places on formulations to say, in order to say these words, you have to meet these time restrictions. So the point of all of this is read your labels and understand the difference between the marketing language that someone may be publishing and what is regulated by the EPA, and meaning it was proven by a study. So today's takeaways. I say it so many times, not all active ingredients perform the same way. It's really important to look at not just classes of chemistry, not just the line of active ingredient, but the classes and how they interact with each other. And secondarily, how the formulations affect the way the active ingredient performs. Understanding your formulation and what you're trying to do is just as important as choosing the right active ingredient for the job. Overall, understanding the tools helps us choose the right tools for the job. And if you don't fully understand, I think you should feel 100% comfortable reaching out to your manufacturing representatives, your distribution representatives, and saying, hey, break this down for me. Or your label doesn't tell me what type of formulation this is. Can you tell me how it would perform in this situation? Label language is regulated. And I encourage you to balance that label language with the marketing information that you most often see. But all of this is just filling in the blanks so that we can ultimately provide the best pest control that our industry has to offer. Setting customer expectations and letting them be a part of what we're trying to do, which is protect the environment and protect their homes and protect their families. Gets a lot of gets a lot of buy-in and allows them again to feel like they're part of the journey. So I appreciate you all being here today. In true Cassie fashion, that is a QR code for my TikTok up there. If you ever have ideas where you're like, hey, can you break this down in a very short micro learning format, I would love for you to shoot me a message on TikTok or LinkedIn, and we can learn more together. And so I'll join you here in just a second for the live Q&A. I look forward to hearing your questions and appreciate your time.